Okay, so let's look at chiefdoms. You could probably guess just from looking at this picture that these are two pretty important individuals. And you would be right. These are chiefs, right? The chief and the chiefly woman over here. You could tell from their regalia that they must be kind of important. We're going to talk more about this regalia, right? The top of the so-called pyramid or social structure is the nobility in ancient Hawaii in these chiefdoms. Here you have some other nobles over here and some other nobles there. They form a small group at the very top. They have the more wealth and more power than the majority of the population, who are farmers. Right? The farmers in ancient Hawaii grew a plant called taro. It's a root crop. They mash it, and it looks like purple mashed potatoes. It's still a traditional part of the Hawaiian diet. You could have it if you ever go to Hawaii, and typically they serve them in the luau's for tourists and stuff like that. But this was a big, important staple crop. Growing taro is very, very labor intensive. The people living on these hilly slopes in the Hawaiian Islands had to figure out a way that they could actually grow the taro crop in what are basically paddies. How do you do that on the hilly area? Well, you have to build terraces. So this is a reconstruction of an archaeological site with these ancient terraces. So you could see that they created these flat steps so that they could grow taro, and they also created little irrigation systems to provide water. And in these ancient villages, the majority of the population, right, in these small villages, the farmers would grow a surplus food. So they would grow more than they themselves needed. And they would give some of that surplus to the chief, right? So the food would come in to where the chief was living. Typically, the chief and the nobles would live in a larger village. Right? Now, why would ancient farmers do that? Why would they give surplus food to the nobles and the chiefs? Well, there were several reasons to do this. One, they could get something back. What do they get in return? It's almost like a social contract. You're giving something to the nobility. The nobility owes you something. So what do they owe you? Well, protection, for one thing. They might be protecting you from another chiefdom or something else. Well, how could the chief protect you? Well, the chief has warriors. Warriors, in order to be, good at what they do, have to train all the time for warfare. Well, if they train for warfare, they can't actually be working in the fields. How do they eat? From the surplus, right? So the surplus goes in, and it remains in the nobility. It's essentially like taxes or tribute. So the food goes in, but it doesn't go back out to the ordinary farmers again. It remains in the hands of the nobility. They use that to support themselves so that they could focus on other things like warfare or crafts. These kahunas, kahuna means expert. They could be craft experts, and they could also be priestly experts, right? So here's a kahuna priest, and here's a kahuna craftsperson, right? The belief system in Hawaii was that the Hawaiian chief was semi-divine and also had connection to the gods, right? So by providing surplus to the chief, you're essentially in some ways providing it to the gods. You're tithing, essentially. And so because the chief is using this to please the gods, to build ceremonial structures like this one, and dedicate it to gods and ancestors, you will get a good harvest next year, right? The gods will be pleased, and life will continue. Right? So it was sort of the reason why the farmers grew surplus and gave it to the chief. One, it was kind of economic, and also it was based on their belief system. So what did the chiefs do with the surplus? They used it to support other nobles, and they used it to support some of these nobles who focused on crafts. And one of the things that we see in chiefdom societies that we don't really see as much in bands and tribes are what are called prestige goods. These things were made by expertly trained craftspeople who were nobles. These are feathered cloaks and a feathered headdress, symbols of being a chief or being a noble. These things are really, really amazing. This is a cloak of the first king of Hawaii. You could see it in the museum in Honolulu. And this headdress is made out of hundreds of tropical bird feathers. One of these cloaks would be made out of thousands of individually hand-woven tropical bird feathers. Now, obviously, this took a huge amount of work. What is to prevent a farmer from making their own feathered cloak? Well, to go back here, you can see 20,000 birds to make this one cloak. Right? So an ordinary farmer would not have the skill, would not have the time, and would not have the resources to make something like this. So prestige goods have power because they're rare, and only certain people can wear them. So either only certain people can own them, or afford to own them, have access to them, or they're deliberately restricted. So a prestige good that might be more familiar to you guys who maybe know more about ancient Rome and than ancient Hawaii would be the color purple or royal blue. Right here you can see this is a Byzantine emperor. You could see obviously the jewels and the gold, but also the cloak is purple. Purple in the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Europe, was a valuable commodity. Why? Because the dye to make the purple came from a mollusk that was found in the Mediterranean Ocean. And so you had to harvest a lot of these mollusks to get enough dye to dye a garment like a toga or a cloak. This made it very, very expensive, and so only certain people could afford them. So that's another example of prestige goods. You could think of many different prestige goods throughout history, right? These are the things that are well crafted, rare. Maybe they're made out of rare substances. Maybe the substance is not rare, but the skill that went into it is rare, right? So think of like a really finely made porcelain vessel, right? The porcelain clay is not that rare. It's not itself a rare substance, right? But the skill of turning that clay into something beautiful then creates a prestige good that not every person could own because only a few people would have the skill to make it. So chiefs increase their power through prestige goods. They have military power, religious power, economic power, and they also build large monuments. They call up people for their labor to build things like religious structures. And they would, the idea that you're building something for the gods is good motivation for people to come and offer their labor. Right? So typically in a chiefdom, it would be different archaeologically than it would be from a band or a tribe, right? How would you identify the difference between a band, a tribe, and a chiefdom? Well, again, if you saw temporary small sites from a certain time period, you're most likely probably looking at a band. If you're looking at slightly larger sites that are lived in all year round, hundreds of people, then you're probably looking at a tribe. If you're looking at, let's say, groups of 1,000 people, 5,000 to maybe 10,000 people, where there are different size sites. Not every site is the same size. You have a small number of really big sites, and then you have a lot of small sites. The big sites might have a big house where the chief lived, right? Like so. The big site might have religious structures. The big site might have storage facilities. The big site might have prestige goods. That would indicate to you, we have something that's a little bit more complex than a tribe or a big man society. We probably have a chiefdom at this point, right? So from the same period, but different size sites, and also the bigger sites have different kinds of things in them than the smaller sites. That would be a chiefdom. Finally, we have states, right? So those large villages where chiefs lived are pretty sizable, but they're not like some of the civilizations of the ancient world where we see big cities, right? So state societies are typically identified through very, very large sites with 100,000 people living in them, not just 5,000 people. So cities, urban societies, right? So this is Ur from Mesopotamia. This is the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan of the Aztec Empire, right? And so within cities, you have a lot of diversity, in terms of ethnic groups, in terms of different kinds of jobs people have. You have markets, you have independent craftspeople, as we'll see. Not just craftspeople make stuff for the nobles. You have independent craftspeople who are trading things in the marketplace. So things are more complex. You have bureaucrats, administrators, governors, lawyers, judges, right? All different kinds of people living in an ancient state. And states emerged, just like agriculture, independently in different areas of the world. So some of the first civilizations were Mesopotamia, which developed on its own. Ancient Egypt developed on its own. The Indus civilization in India. The Chinese civilization. The Maya and the Aztec. And then the Moche, Nazca, other pre-Incan people leading up to the Inca Empire. So archaeologists, who focus on the new archaeology, and obviously archaeologists still today ask the question, how did tribes develop in the chiefdoms? How did chiefdoms develop in the states? What pushed these people, or what motivated them, or what influenced them? What were the factors that made chiefdoms develop in the states? Some people might think, well, the population just got bigger, and over time they developed in the states. When archaeologists test the hypothesis in different areas of the world, they find that that tends not really to explain why states emerged. Right? That it's not just population increase. There's other things going on. So one of the first people to come up with a hypothesis was a guy named Carl Wittfogel. And he came up with this idea called the hydraulic theory. All right, when you look at many of those civilizations, Mesopotamia developed on the Tigris and Euphrates. Egypt developed on the Nile. The Indus civilization developed on the Indus River. Chinese civilization developed on the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. It's like all these ancient civilizations develop on rivers. All right, when you're living on the river, to get the water to your crops at a certain point, as you start to expand your agriculture, you have to build irrigation systems to bring the water from the river to your crops. Well, Wittfogel believed that in order to build those canals, you needed a labor force. Right? He then concluded or hypothesized that to have a labor force do this, you needed organization. Right? Management, administration. You needed people to organize the labor force, to provide food for the labor force, to have a plan in terms of digging and things like that. That's essentially a state bureaucracy or state government. So according to Wittfogel and his idea, the need for irrigation led to the need for more organization, which led to the development of the state. Right? So essentially one need created another need and resulted in the state. So archaeologists have tested this hypothesis. Right? And how would they do that? Well, you obviously would want to pick sites from the right time period. You would want a site that dated to the time of agriculture, or just before agriculture and just after the state, just before the state and just after the state. Right? If you saw around the same time that the state's developing large-scale irrigation systems, that would support this idea. Right? So I'll give you an example from Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, they tested this hypothesis. And what did they see? They saw evidence of the state and small-scale, locally organized irrigation canals. Hundreds of years after the state was in place, then they find very, very large-scale, government-organized irrigation systems. Now, would that support Wittfogel's hypothesis? If you thought, not really, you're right. Because with that information, it looks like in Mesopotamia the state appears first, and then only later do state-run irrigation systems appear, right? That is, in the beginning, the irrigation could be small-scale and organized by farmers themselves. The state was emerging for a different reason in ancient Mesopotamia. Right? So there's lots of different theories now that archaeologists propose and test in these different ancient societies to try and answer that question. Right? So these are the three big research questions. We're going to, as we go through the methods of archaeology, we're going to try and relate the methods back to these larger questions so that we can see what the methods actually can tell us about ancient human societies. Right? Okay, so in the next video, we're going to talk about how you actually find archaeological sites.